All right, AP1 students, in this video we are going to talk about some more passive processes that can occur across the plasma membrane of cells. So let me go to our objectives. And so we're on objective 6 still. The last video we talked about the first passive process. And remember, passive processes are ways that substances get across the plasma membrane, but it doesn't require any energy for them to do that. And so we talked in the last video about diffusion, and we talked about the two types of diffusion, and we also talked about the two types of facilitated diffusion. All right, so recall that when we were talking about diffusion, we were focusing on just the movement of solutes. And so I've been kind of using the word substances through the other videos, but we're going to start switching to using this term solutes, which means essentially the same thing. So when I say solute, what I'm talking about is the atoms, the ions, the various molecules that are in the body. So solute's just a general term when we want to just kind of refer to all of them. As a whole, we'll use the term solute. So when you see that word solute, think of all the atoms, like ions and molecules. So like sodium and chloride and calcium and iron and glucose and proteins. Those are what we're talking about when we use that term solute. So when we were talking about diffusion, we were talking about how we kind of gave you some examples of how certain solutes will get across the plasma membrane. So we were just talking solely about the solutes. So the next type of passive process is osmosis. And this process, we are talking about the movement of water only across the plasma membrane. So in water, its movement across the plasma membrane is a little more unique. And you have to think a little bit more of why it moves across that plasma membrane. So we're going to talk kind of about the specific characteristics of water when we're talking about the plasma membrane, and we'll kind of start with that first, and then talk about the forces that are causing the water to move across there. All right. So for osmosis, I'm going to go back to our chapter. And they have this picture. We'll just kind of keep it there, is probably good. So for our, didn't mean to do that. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to explain this image so we're on the right page. What they've done is they've drawn the plasma membrane. We're in this vertical sort of orientation. So you can hopefully still recognize the phospholipid bilayer. And then there's a couple of transport proteins as well here, those blue. So that's what they're including in this. And then this part is the interstitial fluid, which, remember, that's the outside of the cells. And then this is the cytosol or cytoplasm. So this is inside the cell on this side. So just to orient you to the picture. So like we said, osmosis is the movement of water across this plasma membrane. Now, there's a couple of things we need to understand. You must realize that water can move freely across the plasma membrane through the phospholipid bilayer. So it's kind of similar to carbon dioxide and oxygen. It's small enough that it can just like squeeze through the phospholipid bilayer and move across the plasma membrane. So these little guys here are water molecules. So you can see quite a few of them. And then you can see this, they're showing this one moving just like right between the little phospholipid molecules to get to the other side of the plasma membrane. So water can move across there anytime it wants to. So it's, we use the term permeable when we're talking about the plasma membrane. So we say the plasma membrane is permeable to water because water can move freely across it. It doesn't need any help to do it, and it can do it anytime it wants. So And then there is another way that water, this is kind of where there's some unique properties of water. Water also in the plasma membranes, you'll also have some proteins. They call them aquaporins. So aqua means water, porin kind of think of as a pore. So there are some proteins, they're showing two of them here, transport proteins that water can also, so these are specifically just allowing water to cross that plasma membrane. And these guys are always open, so if they're present, then water can move through them too, as well as through the phospholipid bilayer. Again, water is permeable to water, so it can freely move across this plasma. The plasma membrane is permeable to water, so water can move freely across this plasma membrane anytime that it wants to. All right, so that's one important point to realize. The second point to realize is that most of the solutes that we are referring to in the human body, so like these are glucose, we have some potassium, these are proteins, so those have those unique shapes, quaternary shapes. We also have, they're showing them over here, sodium, chloride, calcium. So that's just a few of the solutes that you can see, some inside the cell and some outside the cell. So the thing with those solutes, we essentially say that they are non-permeable to the plasma or cell membrane. So that just means that the plasma or cell membrane doesn't really let those solutes, like the protein and the glucose and the calcium, sodium, potassium, chloride, doesn't really let them move freely across the plasma membrane. So that's in general for most solutes. Now, we did talk, though, when we talked about diffusion, we talked about sodium moving across the plasma membrane and glucose moving across. But just realize that the plasma membrane will regulate the movement of glucose and sodium and chloride across that plasma membrane. So generally, it doesn't let them move, and then if it does want them to move, then it'll allow for their movement, using a transport protein of some type. So, but just in general, most of them, are not going to be able to freely move across that plasma membrane. And then if they are allowed to move, it's the plasma membrane that's controlling that or regulating it. So those are two important points to know before you start talking about osmosis. All right, so now we're going to talk about why water will want to move in a certain direction across the cell or plasma membrane. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so the reason, we need to understand what the reason is for water wanting to move across that plasma membrane. Now, the reason that you might think is so that water can reach equilibrium or get, equal amounts of water on either side of that plasma membrane. But that is not the case. So that's something key to understand when it comes to osmosis, is that the reason that water moves across this plasma membrane, the ultimate goal is not to get equal amounts of water on the inside of the cell versus the outside of the cell or across that plasma membrane. So the actual goal or reason that water moves, it's wanting to move so that it can get equal amounts of solute on either side of the membrane. So the reason for water movement is so that solute concentration, which are all these atoms, ions, and molecules, is equal or reaches equilibrium on either side of the plasma membrane. So that's the key to understanding osmosis, is that the water moves to get equal amounts or numbers of solutes on either side of the membrane. So the goal is not to get equal amounts of water on either side of the membrane. So the goal is so the reason that the water moves is so the solute concentration on either side of the plasma membrane can be equal, reach equilibrium. Okay, so in the human body, under normal conditions, The body will maintain homeostasis by keeping the solute concentration, so all these little solutes, keeping it equal between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. So that's what our bodies do naturally, is keep the solute concentration equal on either side of the plasma membrane. Now, we can have changes though in the solute concentration. So we can have a change where more solutes, end up in the outside the cell or less. And so then that will be the trigger for water to want to move. And again, it's moving so that we can keep that solute concentration equal on either side of the plasma membrane. All right. So when we are talking about this, I'm going to kind of try to make it more practical. And please forgive my drawing. That's usually why I use the pictures in the textbook, because I'm a horrible artist, or wouldn't even call me an artist. But I'm going to try to help kind of explain the practical reason why it's important to understand osmosis. And we'll give you a kind of a practical experience here. Okay, so again, pardon my drawing, but hopefully it gets the point across. Okay, so what I drew here, because I'll probably need to explain it. Doritos chips, that's probably pretty self-explanatory, mouth. And then this would be the esophagus, and I try to do the stomach, and then some intestines that are really short. So these are the intestines, so I've made them in green over here. And then we have blood vessels that are running along the intestines, so that's what the red here is supposed to be. And then the cell, I just put a cell right here, but realize blood will travel all throughout the body and come in contact with all the cells of the body, but we're just going to make it like right here next to it. So normally, like I said, the body maintains homeostasis by keeping the number of solutes, the number of solutes, or the concentration of solutes in the cell the same as outside the cell. So this is something important to realize, is the blood is considered outside the cell, because the things that are floating in the blood, the solutes, like the atoms and the ions and the various molecules, they are floating in the blood, which is like a watery fluid, but they're not actually in a cell. So this, with the blood in this case, we're using as our example of something that's outside the cell. And then the cell, of course, is representing what's inside the cell. Okay, so normally we have solutes concentration equal between these two, inside the cell and outside the cell. So now let's just pretend that we decided to watch a movie. And so we decided to eat, while we're watching the movie, a whole bag of Doritos chips. So it's got a lot of different nutrients in it, but we're going to focus on sodium and chloride. So, because that's salt. So we're going to focus on the sodium and chloride, or salt, in these chips. So if we eat that whole bag of potato chips, while we're watching the movie, and we're going to focus on the salt in them. That salt from those it's going to end up in our intestines. And then our nutrients that are in our intestines, they get absorbed into our bloodstream. So they'll move from the intestines into our blood. So if we eat this whole bag of chips, we're going to get a whole bunch of sodium and chloride in our blood that wasn't there before. So when that happens, now before we ate the chips, we had this nice solute concentration balance between the cells and the blood. But then we ate those chips. And so now we have like way more sodium and chloride here, so like a higher solute concentration. And remember, the solutes can't pass across the plasma membrane. They're pretty much, they can, but only when the cell membrane allows them to. So they're not going to be able to pass across. So the only thing that freely moves across there is water. So if we have a really high solute concentration in here, and it's higher than what it was here, the water is going to move from the cell into the blood, or the extracellular area here outside the cell, to balance out that solute concentration. So we're going to have the osmosis happening between the cells and the blood in order to get that solute concentration back in balance. So I'm going to talk about this more in the next video because we ran out of time. See you in the next video.